They said the ground moved in Pennsylvania, not the tremors of fault lines, nor the groaning of mines. This was different. It was soil disturbed by hands that worked in silence, loosening earth with purpose, not shovels. It was dirt pressed back down before dawn, tamped flat with the weight of a wooden boot, patted into place as though nothing at all lay beneath. But the ground does not lie. The ground remembers, even when men pretend they have erased their deeds. In 1833, a town whose name was already fading from the map whispered of a sect that had taken root where fields once bore wheat. They had no steeple, no cross nailed high for the passerby to see. Instead, they built inward, closing walls around themselves, trading their surnames for silence, and binding their children in rules that could not be questioned. What they claimed to believe could not be read in any scripture carried by the common man, but only in the breath of a leader whose words spread like mold. He told them the world was ending, and they obeyed. He told them the flesh was weak, and they obeyed. He told them their children were to be purified, and they obeyed. The first body was small, too small for the earth to have any reason to resist. The child's lungs had failed to hold what air was left in the pit, but there had been no struggle, no sound that carried to the barn where hymns were being sung loud enough to smother it. Their doctrine said the world had no future, and that children were the softest clay, souls still impressionable, unmarked, ready for heaven before the filth of adulthood caked them. To the parents, this was not a crime. To the leader, it was not a punishment, it was ritual. The burial was not marked with stone or with cross. It was marked only by the knowing glances exchanged between those who dug and those who watched. The child was not the first to die in the county that year, but was the first to be lowered not in a coffin, but in a silence so complete it might have been mistaken for peace. Neighbors began to notice what was missing before they noticed what was present. Families once seen walking the road into town no longer carried their children with them. Fewer voices called from fields at dusk. Windows remained shuttered, even when summer's air demanded they be opened. At the market, when the cult's members came to buy flour or lamp oil, they came with downturned eyes and left before any questions could be pressed. One farmer swore he saw a child's hand through the slat of a cart, limp as though sleeping, though the parents spoke no word of it. He told himself it was fatigue, nothing more. In places where everyone knew everyone, it was easier to believe the lie than to name the truth. The leader himself was a man who had once been ordinary. Pennsylvania had seen its share of preachers, men who rode from town to town promising salvation in barns and taverns, drawing crowds by the sound of their conviction. Most faded into obscurity, their words burned out as quickly as they were lit. But this man's fire was different. It did not invite warmth, it consumed, and he taught that to be close to him was to be close to God. The closer one came, the more one surrendered. Names, lands, marriages, and finally, children. No ledger was kept, no birth or death recorded in the county book. The children vanished in increments, each disappearance hidden by the sect's insularity, their refusal to speak beyond their own walls. Some said they had moved west, others said they had died of illness. Still others said nothing at all, only lowered their heads as though silence itself were a prayer. When word finally spread, it did not come from the parents. It came from the ground. In a field just beyond the cluster of homes the sect had taken, a neighbor saw that the soil rose where it should have dipped, an uneven patch in the otherwise level land. He watched for days, noting how no seed took root there, how the grass withered, how the earth seemed unsettled. Curiosity led him closer. He pressed his foot on the mound and felt the give beneath it. The discovery was quiet at first. A child's body, wrapped not in linen but in a quilt torn from a mother's bed. Another, wrapped in wool that still carried the smell of smoke. None bore the markings of disease. Their faces, though sunken, were peaceful in a way that made the silence around them even more terrible. The county constable was called, but when he approached the settlement he was met not with denial, but with an unsettling calm. They admitted it. They admitted everything, and yet they spoke of it not as murder, but as offering. The constable wrote in his notes that they believed burial alive was not cruelty but sanctification, that to smother the breath was to preserve the soul, That death, so early, was a mercy, not a crime. He wrote, too, that their eyes did not shift, nor their hands tremble. They were as certain in their testimony as one might be in describing the weather, but the records trail off, as though the paper itself resisted carrying the weight of what was confessed. Few names survive. Fewer dates. What remains is a rumor preserved in fragments, a horror passed down by word of mouth until it faded into the static of folklore. A sect in Pennsylvania, the year 1833, children buried not after death, but as death. Even now, the soil in that part of Pennsylvania is said to hold cold longer than elsewhere. Farmers claim that in winter, frost lies heavier there. Dogs avoid it, pulling their masters away with low growls. Hunters say that when they tread too near, their rifles misfire, their powder damp though no rain has fallen, as if the ground itself remembers and refuses to let the memory be buried again. Pennsylvania in 1833 was not the state remembered in textbooks for its industry or steel, not yet the thrum of mills or the clang of railroads. It was still a place where forests pressed close against farms, where the sound of a bell might carry for miles because there was nothing else to break the silence. Settlers had cut out their clearings with axe and fire, raising barns and cabins where the soil allowed. Roads were nothing more than beaten tracks, mud in spring, dust in summer, frozen ruts in winter. Communities clung to one another out of necessity. Neighbors were lifelines, trading seed, tools, and news. And yet, it was in this environment, where everyone knew everyone else, that a group could form and close itself off so tightly that its darkest practices went unseen. Religion was not a matter of choice but of identity. Pennsylvania was crowded with faiths carried in by immigrants from Germany, from the British Isles, from the eastern seaboard. Baptists, Lutherans, Quakers, Methodists, all planted their flags in the soil. Revivals moved across the land in waves, where itinerant preachers promised salvation under the beams of barns, their voices trembling with ecstasy as they called for repentance. For many, religion was the only spectacle they knew. But alongside the orthodox, the fringe found room to grow. Small sects broke away, convinced that they alone had been granted the truth. Some forbade music, some forbade marriage, some forbade the use of medicine. And when a man with enough charisma declared himself a prophet, a handful of followers was all it took to make his words law. The man who led this sect did not arrive as a stranger. He had been part of the community, worshipped in the same barns, shared meals with the same neighbors. But discontent simmered beneath his ribs. He spoke against the established churches, calling them corrupt, compromised, too eager for the world's comforts. He claimed that God's true message had been lost, diluted by men who feared to speak it plain. Where others read Scripture as command, he read it as suggestion, molding words until they fit the image of his own conviction. And when he began to gather followers, he did so not with threats but with promises. He promised purity. He promised an end to suffering. He promised a nearness to God that could not be bought in any chapel, that could not be found in the sermons of other men. For those who joined him, the promise of being chosen outweighed the suspicion of neighbors. To be chosen meant to rise above the uncertainty of harvests, the ache of disease, the fear of death. To be chosen meant one's children were guaranteed heaven. And so the sect grew. Not large, never large, but deep. The families who followed him gave more than time. They gave up their names, their ties to the outside world. In the county ledgers, the records of marriages, baptisms, and burials, their absence was explained as withdrawal. They've gone inward, neighbors would say. They don't mix with us. To be inward was strange, but not unheard of. In a state already full of separatist groups, the Amish, the Shakers, the Moravians, withdrawal did not immediately mean danger. Inside the sect, life was regimented. Days began before the sun rose, with prayers that stretched long enough to test the knees of the children forced to kneel on hard floorboards. Meals were plain, stripped of seasoning, as though joy itself was sin. Work filled the hours that followed, tending fields, chopping wood, sewing garments that bore no ornament. Laughter was scarce, play rarer still, The children were taught that to smile too wide was vanity, to sing outside of hymns was blasphemy, to question was rebellion against God. Their world narrowed until the only light left came from the leader's words. He spoke often of corruption, of the world outside their walls sinking into sin. He told parents that the world would devour their children if left unguarded, that neighbors, teachers, even kin beyond their circle were poison. He told them that every year a child lived was another year closer to the stain of sin. Better, he said, to preserve them in purity. Better to send them to heaven before the world had claws sharp enough to hold them. At first his words hovered as threat, distant, terrible, but not yet acted upon. Parents trembled at the thought, but when pressed, they reassured themselves it was metaphor, not command. But the day came when metaphor hardened into ritual. A child fell ill, feverish and weak. Neighbors might have called for a doctor, might have begged for herbs or prayers. In the sect, the leader declared it was a sign. This child was being called home, and it was their duty not to resist. The pit was dug shallow, a rectangle no wider than a cradle. The child was lowered in as hymns rose above, and when the soil was pressed back, it was not seen as suffocation, but as sanctification. Parents wept, but not with the grief of loss. They wept as though they had given a gift, a tithe too holy for words. And once the first was buried, the line had been crossed. Rituals harden quickly. What begins as unthinkable becomes custom after repetition. Another child followed, and then another. Each time the act was swaddled in hymns, in doctrine, in the certainty that this was holy work. And each time, the neighbors grew more uneasy. They noticed that children vanished but were not mourned. They noticed that laughter no longer came from the cluster of homes. They noticed, but they did not intervene. Silence is complicity, but it is also survival. In rural Pennsylvania, accusations carried weight. To accuse a man of murder was to make an enemy not just of him, but of all who believed him. To accuse a sect was to risk being seen as godless, meddling, or worse. And so the neighbors whispered in kitchens, in barns, behind closed doors. They told themselves they must be mistaken. They told themselves it was not their place. They told themselves that perhaps the children truly had gone west, or fallen ill, or slipped quietly into the earth by natural means. It is easier to believe a comforting lie than to face the fracture of reality. To accept that parents could bury their own children alive is to accept that the boundary between human and monster is thinner than imagined. It was easier for the neighbors to turn away, and in their turning, the sect deepened. The children inside the sect lived with death as both warning and promise. They saw their siblings vanish, their friends erased, and yet were told it was love. They learned that obedience was survival, that silence was safety, that their only worth lay in how quickly they could surrender. Some prayed each night to be chosen, not out of piety but out of fear. Better to die now, they thought, than to live long enough to become corrupted. The leader's power grew not because he held a sword, but because he held the parents' grief and bent it to his will. In a world where childhood death was already common, he convinced them that loss was not tragedy but triumph. He twisted fear into faith, and faith into ritual. And so the soil of Pennsylvania became his altar. Yet outside their walls, the wider county was not blind. The constable heard whispers. Farmers reported the strange mounds in the fields. Traders spoke of how the sect's members came to market without children who once clung to their skirts. The church in town wondered why no baptisms had been requested, no marriages blessed. The silence was not absence. It was presence, looming and undeniable. When the constable finally stepped onto their land, he found not resistance, but eerie calm. They did not deny. They did not hide. They welcomed him with the same quiet they gave one another, certain that their righteousness was proof against any law of man. He recorded their confessions, though the ink itself seemed to recoil at what it carried. His notes survive only in fragments, but they are enough. Enough to tell us that in 1833 in Pennsylvania, a sect believed it holy to bury children alive. And then the records stop. What happened after? The arrests, the dispersal, the fates of the parents, has been eaten by silence. Whether by fire, by deliberate erasure, or by neglect, The details are gone. What remains is the horror itself, unanchored by names, floating as a warning. The county could not ignore them forever. Pennsylvania was wide, but not wide enough to hide children vanishing like smoke. Farmers in the fields spoke of it in low tones, voices catching when they said the word buried. Market women traded not only flour and salt, but rumors, passing them as coins, each story smaller than the last, worn smooth by retelling, but never stripped of its sharpness. The sect had crossed from strange to dangerous, and still, their cluster of homes sat quiet on the edge of town, lanterns burning late into the night, hymns rising like fog above their roofs. Neighbors began to count. They counted children they remembered, and the tally no longer matched the faces that appeared in town. One farmer's wife swore she had seen 5, and now there were only 2. Another recalled the sound of laughter from a barn loft, but months had passed with only silence. The more they counted, the less they could deny. Children were missing. And where children are missing, suspicion takes root. But suspicion does not grow evenly. Some were too afraid to speak. To accuse a man of burying his own child was to shatter the fragile web of community. To accuse an entire sect was to declare war against faith itself. Others were too weary to intervene. Death was common. Children were lost to fever, to accidents, to winters too long and cruel. Perhaps, they said, it was nothing more than tragedy. Better not to look too close. Better not to name the thing hiding in plain sight. Yet some could not let it go. They saw the mounds in the earth, the patches of soil that refused to green. They saw the quilts missing from washing lines, the quilts that might have been wrapped around children. They noticed that dogs avoided certain fields, skirting them with hackles raised. They could not look away, and so the whispers spread further. The constable's visit did not end the matter. His notes, scattered and incomplete, carried little weight against a community too afraid to act. The sect continued. The leader preached louder, his words now tinged with defiance. He told his followers that persecution was proof of their chosenness, that the world hated them because they were righteous, that every whisper, every suspicious glance was the mark of Satan gnashing against their holiness. The parents clung tighter. Fear of the outside world pressed them deeper inward. They withdrew further from markets, further from neighbors, until their lives narrowed to the borders of the sect alone. To step outside was to risk corruption. To remain inside was to remain safe. And so the children still alive grew paler, thinner, their eyes carrying shadows no child's eyes should bear. One story survives, though whether in truth or in folklore, it is impossible to say. A child, perhaps 8, fled one night. Barefoot, their feet torn by stone and bramble, they stumbled to the door of a farmhouse gasping, unable to speak. The farmer's wife brought them inside, pressed water to their lips, and listened as the words tumbled out in fragments. Dirt, hymns, darkness, the others gone. The leader's voice commanding silence as soil closed above. The farmer did not sleep that night, nor did his wife. They argued in whispers, torn between fear and duty. To shelter the child was to provoke the sect. To return them was to betray their trust. By dawn, the child was gone, vanished as though the night had swallowed them back. Some said the sect had come and reclaimed what was theirs. Others said the child fled further, deeper into woods no one dared follow. The truth was never found. What remained was the chill that settled in the farmhouse for years after, as though the child's fear had soaked into its beams. The county's ministers gathered. Some preached fire, demanding the sect be broken by force. Others counseled patience, urging that God himself would bring judgment in time. None could agree, and so nothing was done. And while men argued, children continued to vanish. Inside the sect, the rituals grew more elaborate. No longer was burial a silent act of obedience. It became a performance, cloaked in ceremony. Parents dressed their children in plain white garments, as though for baptism, and carried them out beneath the moon. Hymns rose louder, drowning any sound the children might make. Earth was heaped with rhythm, tamped down in unison, until the mound was smooth, almost beautiful in its finality. The leader spoke words that twisted scripture into shapes unrecognizable, promising that each burial was another stone in the foundation of heaven. The children who watched learned not to cry. To cry was to be noticed, and to be noticed was to be chosen. They held their breath when the soil shifted, their hearts hammering, praying they would not be next. And in their silence, obedience took root so deep that it strangled any thought of escape. The neighbors began to fear not just the sect, but themselves. They feared their own hesitation, their own willingness to look away. They feared that by allowing it, they had become complicit. But fear without action curdles into dread, and dread is paralyzing. Some moved away, selling their farms for less than they were worth just to put distance between themselves and the cursed ground. Others stayed, bound by land and debt, resigned to live alongside horror. The constable's second visit brought no resolution. He asked questions, recorded answers, but when faced with calm confessions spoken without shame, he faltered. The law in 1833 was not built to handle the unthinkable. Murder was crime enough, but what was it when parents themselves called it holy? What was it when no one came forward to accuse, when the very victims were buried too deep to speak? He left with his notes unfinished, his resolve thinned, and the sect continued. And so the conflict did not explode. It simmered. It stretched across years, festering in silence. A war not of guns or blades, but of whispers, glances, and the slow erosion of trust. The sect dug deeper into their conviction, while the county built higher walls of denial. Each side entrenched itself, unwilling or unable to confront the other. But the ground did not rest. The ground shifted, season after season, rain and thaw unsettling the shallow graves. Bones rose closer to the surface, quilts unraveled, wool dissolved. Evidence that refused to stay buried. Children who refused to be erased. One spring, a flood swept through the valley, pulling earth from the fields, washing away topsoil. When the waters receded, the land bore scars. In one patch near the sect's settlement, the scars revealed more than stone. A quilt corner, a bone too small to belong to livestock, a lock of hair, tangled and pale. The neighbors could no longer pretend. The earth itself had spoken. Now the whispers became accusations. They carried not just through farms, but into the town square, into the tavern, into the courthouse. Parents with no children to show were named aloud. The leader was called monster, sorcerer, devil. The sect was branded unholy. Fear turned outward, no longer paralyzing, but sharpening into anger. And anger, once named, cannot be recalled. The rising conflict was no longer hidden in barns or whispered in kitchens. It was out in the open, hanging over Pennsylvania like a storm. The question was no longer if it would break, but when. The storm did not arrive with thunder. It came with footsteps. Boots on wet ground, measured, hesitant, but too many to be ignored. A line of men from the county, farmers with lanterns, ministers with books, the constable with his pistol heavy on his hip. They came not as a mob, but as something quieter, more dangerous, men who had argued for years in whispers, and now could no longer remain still. It was not anger alone that drove them, but shame. Shame that they had turned away. Shame that they had allowed the soil to speak louder than their own voices. The sect heard them coming. The settlement stirred, shutters pulled tight, lamps extinguished. The leader did not tremble. He called his people together, gathered them in the meeting room where the floorboards bore grooves from years of knees pressed down in prayer. He told them this was the test they had been promised, the final trial before heaven opened. He told them not to fear, for persecution was proof. If the world came for them, it was only because the world belonged to the devil. His calm spread like oil, coating fear until it became obedience. When the county men reached the meeting house, they found the door already open. Inside, the sect stood in rows, silent, faces pale in the lantern light. The leader stepped forward, his eyes steady, and welcomed them as though they were guests. He did not deny. He did not beg. He spoke as though reciting scripture, explaining their doctrine, their duty, their holy offering. He spoke of children as seeds plucked before weeds could choke them. He spoke of death as mercy, of earth as cradle, of silence as hymn. The men who listened did not shout him down. They could not. The words froze them, made their throats close, To hear such calm certainty spoken of what they had whispered in fear was to feel the floor tilt beneath them. The constable steadied his hand on his pistol, but did not draw. The ministers clutched their Bibles, but did not open them. The farmers stared at the floor, unable to lift their eyes to the parents who stood beside their leader, silent, complicit. At last, one man spoke. He demanded to see the ground. The leader agreed. He led them out into the night, past barns and fields, to the patches of soil where the earth sagged in unnatural ways. He gestured, almost proud, as though showing a crop newly planted. The men stared at the mounds, their lanterns casting shadows that looked too much like children crouched beneath. The constable ordered them dug. Shovels bit into earth that resisted, heavy with the weight of rain and secrecy. The work was slow, deliberate, every scrape of iron against stone echoing in the night. Then came the sound no one was prepared for, the hollow thud of wood. A coffin, small, unmarked. It was lifted, opened. Inside, a child's body wrapped in quilt, hands folded, face pale but preserved by cold soil. There was no disease, no wound, only stillness, unnatural, final. Another mound was opened, and another. Each revealed the same. Children laid down as though asleep, but too many, far too many. The men's hands shook. Some turned away, vomiting into the grass. Others wept openly, lanterns trembling in their grip. Ministers muttered prayers through clenched teeth, but the words felt thin, inadequate against the weight of what the ground had given back. The leader did not flinch. He stood at the edge of the graves, his face illuminated by lantern light, serene as though witnessing a sacrament. He told them again it was holy, that these children had been spared corruption, that heaven had received them with open arms. He spoke with such conviction that for a moment one of the farmers felt his knees buckle, as though belief itself could pull him under. But then he saw the face of a child, hair tangled, lips parted as though caught mid-breath, and conviction shattered into rage. The mob broke then, not with fists, not with guns, but with shouts. Parents were dragged from the line, forced to their knees, demanded to speak. "Why?" the farmers cried. "Why would you bury your own?" The parents did not resist. They whispered the same words as their leader, that it was holy, that it was mercy, that they had saved their children. Their calm was more terrifying than denial would have been. The constable tried to restore order, but order had long since rotted. The farmers wanted justice, swift and brutal. The ministers wanted exorcism. The constable wanted law, procedure, proof. But the graves themselves were proof, and proof has a way of silencing all other arguments. The sect was taken under guard, herded into the meeting house. Parents wept, not for their children, but for the loss of their ritual. They clutched one another, prayed aloud, their words tumbling into a chaos of hymns. The leader stood apart, silent now, as though he had already transcended the moment, his eyes fixed on something no one else could see. The county faced a question it was not prepared to answer. What do you do with people who confess freely, who see no crime in what they have done? To hang them would be to make martyrs. To imprison them would be to keep their poison alive. To release them would be unthinkable. The courthouse filled with arguments that stretched late into the night, voices cracking under the weight of indecision. In the end, the record fades. Some say the leader was taken east, tried in a larger city, though no verdict survives. Others say he vanished, spirited away by loyal followers, his name erased, but his shadow lingering. The parents are said to have scattered, some fleeing west, others swallowed by poverty and shame. The sect as a body dissolved, its houses abandoned, its fields left to weeds. But the graves remained. Children do not leave easily. Their absence echoes. The farms nearby never prospered again. Crops withered, livestock sickened, families moved away. The land itself seemed cursed, as though the earth had absorbed the horror and refused to let life take root again. Travelers spoke of strange sounds at night, of hymns carried on wind when no voices were near, of lanterns glowing where no house stood. The story slipped from record into rumor, from rumor into folklore. It was easier to call it a tale, a warning, a fable of what faith unchecked can do. Easier to let it be forgotten than to carry the full weight of what had been unearthed. And yet, fragments remain. Enough to remind us that in 1833, in Pennsylvania, children were buried not by strangers, not by enemies, but by their own parents, convinced it was holy. The climax was not fire, nor blood, but silence breaking. Silence that had cloaked horror until the ground itself tore it open. Silence that had protected monsters who did not see themselves as monsters. And when silence breaks, it does not mend. When the lanterns were snuffed and the meeting house emptied, what remained in Pennsylvania was not relief but rot. The sect was gone, but absence is not the same as peace. The neighbors who had dug the graves closed them again, shoveling earth with trembling hands, but they could not close the silence that followed. The air carried a weight, thick and unshakable, as though the land itself remembered too much. The parents taken into custody disappeared into a fog of legal ambiguity. Some say they were marched east, shackled and silent, their faces turned away from the crowd that gathered to watch them leave. Others whispered that they were released quietly, allowed to scatter to other counties, their shame their only prison. The leader's fate is even murkier. A handful of notes suggest he was transported to Philadelphia, but no record of trial survives. No cell bears his name, no gallows holds his ghost. It is as if, once torn from the soil of his sect, he dissolved into shadow, leaving only his teachings behind. The farms near the settlement suffered first. Fields that once yielded wheat now sprouted weeds. Livestock sickened without reason. Wells turned brackish, as though the earth itself rejected the hands that tilled it. Families moved away, selling land for pennies on the dollar, abandoning barns that sagged like broken ribs. The few who stayed told stories of unease, strange cries at night, shadows moving at the edge of lantern light, the sound of hymnals carried on wind though no voices sang. For the county, the shame cut deeper than the horror. To discover children buried alive was one thing. To admit they had been buried with the knowledge, or at least the suspicion, of neighbors was another. Each farmer who had whispered but not spoken felt the weight of guilt pressing on his chest. Each minister who had counseled patience rather than intervention tasted ash in his sermons. Each woman who had seen the empty arms of her neighbor and said nothing found her prayers falling flat. The guilt did not fade. It curdled. Families moved west not only for land but for escape, hoping that distance could scrub their names from the memory of what had been allowed. Those who remained clung tighter to their churches, desperate to prove their piety was not complicity. They sang louder, prayed longer, and cast suspicious glances at any new preacher who passed through. Charisma, once a source of excitement, became cause for fear. Every raised voice reminded them of the leader who had convinced parents to turn spades against their own. Children born after carried stories like shadows. They were told not to wander near the abandoned settlement, not to play in the fields where the graves lay, not to listen if they heard singing in the night. Some obeyed, their fear keeping them close to hearth and bed. Others, drawn by the forbidden, crept to the edges of the cursed land. They returned pale, shivering, swearing they had felt the ground shift beneath their feet, as though something buried was still trying to rise. Folklore grew where fact faltered. Some said the children's spirits walked in pairs, hand in hand, their eyes hollow, their mouths open in silent song. Others claimed the leader still preached beneath the earth, his voice rising through the soil like gas through coal seams, poisoning any who lingered too long. Hunters told of finding deer carcasses on the fields, not torn by predator, but laid down as though buried shallow and left to rot. The county tried to erase it. Maps redrew borders so that the settlement's name no longer appeared. Records were left incomplete, births and deaths unlisted. Ministers discouraged talk, calling it blasphemy to dwell on sin. Parents hushed their children when they asked questions. But silence is porous. The story slipped through, carried in hushed tones, retold by those who needed to explain why the land remained empty. It became America's horror, but a forgotten one. Forgotten not because it lacked weight, but because it carried too much. And yet, forgetting is never complete. The land remembers. In winter, frost clings longer to the soil of those fields than anywhere else. In spring, seeds fail to sprout or grow twisted, pale as bone. Dogs still refuse to cross it. Travelers still claim to feel watched when they pass by. Some say the air is colder there, even on summer nights, a chill that seeps into bone, and does not leave until the traveler has put miles between themselves and the cursed ground. The families who once belonged to the sect are harder to trace. Surnames vanish, reappear in distant counties, altered by a single letter, perhaps to escape recognition. Oral histories break into fragments: a grandmother who forbade singing, a great-uncle who prayed too long, a cousin who would not speak of childhood. The bloodlines scattered, but memory has a way of clinging. Even now, descendants might live unaware of what their ancestors buried, carrying the weight of silence without ever knowing its source. For the county that remained, the aftermath left scars not only on land, but on trust. Communities grew wary of difference. Newcomers were scrutinized, their beliefs dissected, their children counted. Faith itself was tempered, stripped of wildness, confined to the safety of established churches. Revivalists found fewer eager ears. Promises of new revelation were met with suspicion. The cost of charisma had been seen, and no one wished to pay it again. Yet history does not vanish because it is unwanted. It waits, and sometimes it waits in the ground. Farmers still tell stories, though their voices dip low when they do. They say the earth there is restless. They say the graves shift, refusing to stay still. They say that sometimes when plowing too deep, the soil coughs up fragments: a quilt thread, a child's shoe, a tooth too small to mistake. Each fragment is a reminder that what was buried cannot be buried forever. And so the fallout lingered. Not in courts, not in gallows, not in prisons, but in silence, shame, and soil. The cult dissolved, but the memory of it became part of the landscape. Pennsylvania carried it forward not in records but in whispers, and whispers, though fragile, endure. The graves are not marked. No stone carries the names of the children. No cross rises to catch the sun. There is nothing to kneel before, nothing to tend with flowers, nothing to remember except the soil itself. And yet, absence is its own monument. The uncut fields, the frost that lingers too long, the dogs that refuse to tread. These are the markers, subtle and unyielding. The land remembers even when people choose not to. History prefers the clean lines of dates and verdicts. It wants trials, convictions, punishments that can be recorded in ink and cited in books. But this story resists. The records blur, the names vanish, the outcome dissolves. What remains is not justice, but unease. A hollow in the archive where children should have been, where parents should have stood accused, where law should have spoken. The silence is the record. The silence is the testimony. What does it mean that parents could bury their own alive and call it holy? What does it mean that neighbors could suspect and still look away? It means the line between faith and fanaticism is thinner than we want to believe. It means that community can shield horror as easily as it shields life. It means that silence is not neutral. Silence is action, heavy as soil. The sect is gone. Its houses collapsed. Its barns rotted, its leader swallowed by rumor. But what it revealed remains. That charisma can twist fear into devotion. That ritual can smother instinct. That belief, unchecked, can devour even the bond between parent and child. We want to imagine monsters as outsiders, strangers at the gate. But the truth is worse. The monsters stood at the hearth, cradled children, whispered prayers, and believed themselves righteous. The community, too, bore its share. It did not dig the graves, but it allowed them to be dug. It did not press soil over small bodies, but it pressed silence over suspicion. And in that silence, horror thrived. This is the part history rarely admits, that the worst things survive not only by the hand of those who act, but by the hands of those who do not. When we look back on 1833, we see not only a cult in Pennsylvania, but a reflection of ourselves. How often do we choose comfort over confrontation? How often do we silence the questions that rise, because to ask them would break the fragile peace we cling to? The story unsettles not because it is distant, but because it is familiar. It shows what happens when fear, shame, and faith braid together unchallenged. The children buried there will never be named. They will never be counted in census or recorded in church books. Their voices ended in soil, but their silence lingers. And perhaps that is the truest horror, that what was forgotten by people has not been forgotten by the ground. Some still say on certain nights when the wind carries a thin high note across the fields, you can hear hymns that are not sung by any living voice. Some say you can feel a hand at your ankle, small, insistent, tugging you back from the mound where you should not step. Some say the earth itself breathes there, shallow and uneven, as though still unsettled by the lives it swallowed. Whether you believe in ghosts or not, the story remains. Not carved in stone, not written in law, but etched into silence. A silence that spreads when neighbors whisper but do not speak. A silence that deepens when parents surrender to fear. A silence that buries the living and calls it faith. And so we remember. Not to glorify, not to dwell in gore, but to hold a mirror. To remind ourselves that horror is not only the sudden act of violence, but the slow erosion of conscience. To remind ourselves that the unthinkable can become custom if no one resists. To remind ourselves that the ground beneath us is never as empty as it seems. In 1833 in Pennsylvania, a cult buried its children alive. America chose to forget. The land did not, and when the soil itself remembers, forgetting is no longer possible.